The laughter reached her before the doors fully opened, a thin, silver sound that slid beneath the music and cut sharper than any insult spoken aloud. It told her without sight exactly where she stood in the room, at its edge, at its mercy. She paused on the threshold, gloved fingers tightening around the ivory handle of her walking cane, while whispers braided themselves into a single, living thing that breathed against her skin. Poor creature. Such a pity. Why bring her at all? Each murmur was softened by politeness, yet sharpened by certainty, and she felt them land with the practiced precision of stones tossed by gentle hands. Her name was spoken rarely, and when it arrived weighted with sympathy rather than interest. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, blind since childhood, niece to a distant baron, possessed of a modest dowry and an inconvenience no lace or lineage could disguise. The chandeliers above her crackled with light she could not see, but she sensed their presence in the way warmth settled over her hair and the faint scent of beeswax and smoke drifted downward. The ballroom breathed, a living space full of silk, cologne, and judgment, and she inhaled carefully, steadying herself against the familiar tide of sound. At her heel patted the small, warm reassurance she trusted more than any arm offered to her. The puppy's steps were soft but confident, his collar giving a quiet chime each time he moved. He paused when she paused, pressed closer when her breath caught, and leaned his head briefly against her ankle as though to remind her she was not alone. Her late father had pressed the wriggling creature in her hands 3 winters before his death, saying nothing more than, "He will tell you what the world will not." Tonight, she clung to that memory like a talisman. The music swelled, violins rising in an eager arc, and Eleanor was guided forward by a cousin whose hand rested lightly at her elbow, already reluctant. She sensed the room rearranging itself around her, bodies turning, eyes lifting, curiosity souring into discomfort. Suitors stood nearby. She could hear the stiff adjustment of coats, the deliberate clearing of throats, but none spoke directly to her. Questions were asked of her cousin instead, as though Eleanor herself were a delicate parcel that might break if addressed too suddenly. How unfortunate, a woman murmured, not nearly softly enough. Such a sweet voice, though. If only. The phrase followed Eleanor like a shadow. If only she could see. If only she might smile the right face. If only she might admire the right fortune. She had learned long ago that blindness did not merely remove sight. It invited speculation. People filled the darkness they imagined she lived within with their own assumptions. And tonight they assumed she was desperate. She was not. Or, at least, she had taught herself not to be. Longing lived in her, yes, but it had been disciplined in a silence, folded neatly behind composure. She listened instead, to the rustle of skirts, the precise rhythm of shoes upon polished floor, the way voices changed when someone of consequence entered the room. It was how she survived gatherings such as this, decoding the unspoken architecture of power and desire without ever glimpsing its faces. A gentleman was brought near her, introduced briskly, his name trailing too quickly for her to catch. He bowed. She knew this from the faint whoosh of movement and the expectation that followed, but when she lifted her chin, offering her attention, his breath faltered. He spoke to her cousin again, voice pitched with a tight politeness that betrayed discomfort. Eleanor felt the moment stretch, then break. "Perhaps another time," he said, already stepping away. The humiliation was small, almost delicate, but it burned all the same. Her fingers curled in on themselves, nails pressing into kid leather, while the puppy shifted at her side, alert. She forced herself to breathe, to remain still, to remember she had endured worse than quiet rejection dressed as courtesy. Still, the music seemed to falter, as though the room itself hesitated in sympathy or in relief. It was then that her guardian's voice cut through the murmurs, brisk and edged with resolve. He had grown tired, Eleanor realized, of watching her be measured and dismissed like flawed china. His words carried farther than intended, and the room leaned in despite itself. "If the gentleman cannot decide," he announced. "Perhaps we shall allow instinct to do what sight will not." A ripple of laughter followed, surprised and sharp. Eleanor's heart stumbled. Before she could ask what he meant, she felt the gentle release of the lead at her hand. The puppy hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, nails clicking softly against the floor as he moved away from her for the first time that evening. Gasps fluttered. Someone laughed again, louder now, delighted by novelty. Heat rushed to Eleanor's face. She understood at once. She was to be made a spectacle, her future reduced to a clever diversion. Yet beneath the mortification, something else stirred, a fragile, unwelcome spark of hope. The puppy had never failed her. Not once. The room grew quiet as the small creature wandered among the gathered men, pausing, circling, dismissing with an indifferent flick of tail. Eleanor tracked his movement through sound and intuition, heart hammering as seconds stretched. Then, suddenly he stopped. He sat. Silence fell, heavy and complete. Eleanor felt it before anyone spoke, felt the shift in the air, the subtle straightening of spines. She followed the line of that stillness inward toward a presence she had not yet noticed, one marked not by noise, but by restraint. Somewhere ahead of her, a man knelt. She heard fabric move, slow and deliberate, and then a voice spoke low and even, directed not at her blindness, but at her dog. "Well done," the man said with quiet warmth. Eleanor's breath caught, and in that instant, the laughter was gone. The ballroom changed the moment the puppy chose him. Eleanor could not see the shift, but she felt it, like the sudden tightening of the world around a single point. The murmurs quieted, not out of courtesy, but curiosity sharpened to a point so fine it trembled in the air. Her breath warmed the silk edge of her glove as she steadied herself, sensing the polished floor beneath her shoes grow strangely vast. Somewhere near the center of that stillness, the man her puppy had chosen remained kneeling. She heard no scrambling, no awkward recovery, only a measured rise, each movement unhurried, deliberate, as though he answered not to the room, but to some private rhythm neither gossip nor grandeur could touch. Her cousin attempted to reclaim control of the moment, offering a thin laugh. "Well, this is unusual." But his discomfort dissolved into silence when the man finally spoke, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for the creature before him. "You have excellent instincts, little one." His voice held that rare quality of unforced authority, the kind that did not need to raise its volume to command attention. Eleanor felt the words settle over her like a warm cloak cinched gently at the throat. Her pulse stuttered, not from excitement, but from a soft, bewildered fear, the fear that something important had shifted beneath her feet. Then she sensed him approaching, not because he moved loudly, he did not, but because the air trembled around his steps, as though the sound of him was carried differently. She lifted her chin a fraction, the way she had practiced for years to convey confidence she did not always feel. Her fingers tightened subtly on her cane, ensuring she stood straight even as her heart beat an uneven rhythm. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, and the way he shaped her name was unlike the others. No pity, no hesitation, no audible smile of condescension. He spoke her name as if it were simply a fact, one to be respected. She fought the instinct to turn toward her cousin, seeking silent cues about her suitor's reaction. Instead, she forced herself to face the voice directly, letting it anchor her. "My guardian did not intend theatrics," she murmured, grateful her voice held steady even as her cheeks warmed. "I apologize for this rather unconventional moment." "You owe no apology," he replied immediately, and the firmness of his tone startled her. "Those who laugh do so because courage unsettles them." His voice lowered, softer now. "Your companion simply reminded this room what sincerity looks like." Her breath slipped unevenly from her lungs. She tried to form a reply, but the words tangled in her throat. It had been years since anyone had offered her such direct, unembellished respect. A shift of fabric suggested he bowed. A gesture so controlled she sensed the grace of it without sight, and then an arm extended toward her. She felt the faint displacement of air before his gloved hand came close enough for her to sense its presence, waiting but not touching. He had offered his arm, she realized, but without assuming she would take it. A kindness, a question, a choice. "May I escort you to the floor?" he asked. "Only if you wish it." Her puppy gave a single soft huff, as though nudging her forward. The faint jingle of his collar accompanied the encouragement. Eleanor inhaled slowly, letting her gloved fingers drift outward until they brushed the man's offered arm. She felt the warmth beneath the fine wool, the steady strength contained in the stillness. She tightened her hold just enough to show acceptance. He did not rush. He guided her with a feather-light steadiness, adjusting his pace to hers without hesitation. The music shifted into a waltz, its sweeping rhythm filling the space around them as they stepped onto the polished floor. She heard whispers surge again like a tide, astonishment, disbelief, something else she could not name. But when he placed one hand carefully at her waist, the world beyond that single touch faded. He kept his palm respectful, almost tentative, as though conscious of every boundary she might fear. His other hand found hers with a gentle firmness, fingers curling in a way that felt protective rather than possessive. "Are you comfortable?" he murmured. A question so simple, yet no one had asked her that in years. "Yes," she whispered. As they began to move, Eleanor listened not to the orchestra, but to him, his breaths steady and measured, the quiet shift of fabric when he turned, the faint scrape of shoe when he adjusted to catch her balance. Each detail felt like a gift. The world she could not see became a world she could feel, guided not by sight, but by trust. She felt her body loosen, her steps smoothing into his rhythm, and for a brief moment she forgot the weight of being watched. She forgot the whispers. She forgot the fear that her presence embarrassed others. "What color is the room?" she asked softly. He answered without hesitation, as though he had known she would ask. "Gold," he said, "but a warm gold, like the last moments of a winter sunset." There was no pity in his tone, only vivid description. "The chandeliers have droplets of crystal that catch the light like melting snow. The gowns around us move like frost stirred by wind." She closed her eyes, not to see, but to imagine. "And the people, they stare," he said simply, the honesty startling her. "But their stares matter less than you think." His hand at her waist firmed a fraction, guiding her flawlessly through a turn. "Most people chase novelty," he added, voice softening again. "Few recognize truth when it stands before them." "How strange," she murmured, "that truth should be chosen by a puppy." "And yet," he replied, "he chose perfectly." Her heart fluttered in a fragile, aching way that frightened her with its intensity. No man had ever spoken to her like this, with gravity, with gentleness, with a sense that he saw her beyond the blindness others fixated upon. But as the dance continued, she sensed tension threading through the room. A chill replaced warmth. Whispers thickened. Someone uttered her name in a tone slick with amusement. She felt an old familiar dread uncoil in her stomach, the dread of being made into spectacle once more. The Duke, if his voice and bearing were anything to judge by, he must surely be a man of that rank, seemed to sense the shift as well. His movements grew sharper, more precise, guiding her in a way that shielded rather than displayed. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. "I do. Do they mock us?" "They mock what they cannot understand." His voice deepened subtly. "Your courage unsettles them. Your presence challenges a world accustomed to easy answers." Her steps faltered for a moment, and his hand steadied her instantly, the subtle pressure of his fingers grounding her against the rising anxiety. "You may leave if this is too much," he murmured, voice dipped low so only she could hear. "Say the word, and I shall take you away from every voice in this room." The offer felt like both mercy and danger. Her breath trembled. "I cannot flee every time they whisper." "No," he said gently. "You cannot. But you should never face them alone." Something fragile cracked inside her then, not with pain, but with recognition. He spoke as though he understood battles fought in silence, as though he carried wounds invisible to sight, just as she did. The waltz slowed. His fingers loosened but did not release her hand completely, holding her in a suspended moment she wished could last forever. Her puppy padded close again, nudging her leg as though sensing the shift in her breathing. "Miss Whitcomb," the man murmured. "May I?" Before he could finish, footsteps approached, sharp and purposeful. The air chilled. A woman's voice, smooth, glinting like polished steel, cut through the fragile peace of the moment. "So, this is the man your little creature selected." Eleanor stiffened. She knew that voice. Lady Ashbury, one of the cruelest whisperers in London. Her words always carved deeper than they sounded. Eleanor felt her puppy press into her leg protectively, fur rising. Lady Ashbury continued, tone sweet but soaked in venom. "How charming. A blind girl choosing a duke through a dog. Truly a delightful spectacle. One wonders, a pause, deliberate and cruel, if the duke understands what he is stepping into." Eleanor felt the man beside her grow very still, not with anger, but with controlled intensity, as though his silence had suddenly become the most formidable presence in the room. Then he spoke, quiet, even, dangerous in its calm. "Madam," he said, "I understand perfectly." Eleanor felt her heart stop, because she sensed, in the breath between his words, that something had shifted, something irreversible. And the room, for the first time that night, grew afraid. Eleanor felt the Duke's stillness like a shield forming around her, silent yet resolute, as though the very air rearranged itself to obey the quiet command of his presence. Lady Ashbury's perfume, jasmine sharpened by intent, drifted too close, and Eleanor instinctively shifted her weight back, her gloved fingers tightening around her cane. Her puppy pressed into her skirts, a tiny growl humming in his small chest, yet even that soft sound felt like bravery in a room that had offered her none. But the Duke did not step away. Instead, he angled his body with a subtle, deliberate motion, shielding her from the circle of eyes she could not see and from the ridicule she had felt before it was ever spoken. The hush he created was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a quiet authority that pulled the attention of every listener. Eleanor sensed something in his stance, a rare steadiness that suggested he was accustomed to holding ground no one else dared to claim. "I understand perfectly," he had said, and though the words were simple, their weight was not. Lady Ashbury made a sound between a laugh and a scoff. "Do you? Or is this merely a performance? A charitable impulse, perhaps?" Her voice curled like smoke around the edges of the moment. "Surely you do not intend to encourage her beyond a dance." Eleanor's heart clenched. The humiliation struck deeper than when suitors avoided her. This was different. This was an accusation that she was unworthy of even a moment's genuine attention. She forced her chin upward, refusing the instinct to shrink. "Lady Ashbury," she said softly, steadying her tone, "your concern is unnecessary." "Oh, my dear," the woman purred. "On the contrary, I only wish to spare you disappointment. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall." The Duke's voice cut through the air again, quieter, yet far more dangerous for its calm. "That will be enough." Eleanor felt the pause before Lady Ashbury answered, as though the other woman had suddenly realized the edge she was leaning too close to. "I meant no offense, Your Grace." "Your Grace." The title struck Eleanor like a physical touch. Her breath tightened as the truth settled. Her puppy had chosen a duke indeed, not merely a gentleman, not simply a voice of kindness, but someone whose influence could redraw the room with a single syllable. Yet the shock of that revelation twisted with something sharp and fragile. Why would a man of such stature trouble himself with her? Why would he shield a blind girl whose presence had been met with stifled laughter since the moment she entered the room? The Duke stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence brush her arm like a fleeting reassurance. "Miss Whitcomb," he said gently, "will you accompany me to the conservatory? The air in this room has grown overly perfumed." The faintest trace of humor threaded his voice, subtle, respectful, but it coaxed the breath back into her lungs. Before she could respond, her cousin stammered something about impropriety, But the Duke brushed aside the objection with effortless civility. "I assure you," he said, "my intentions are entirely honorable, and she deserves the courtesy of fresh air." Eleanor hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because she feared the truth she might discover if she accepted. Yet her puppy nudged her again, insistent, tail flicking against her skirts. She exhaled slowly. "Yes, Your Grace. Thank you." He offered his arm. She accepted. The ballroom stilled as they walked. Not a dramatic hush, but the stunned quiet of people who had expected a spectacle and instead found themselves witnessing something far more troubling: sincerity. Her cane clicked softly against the marble floor, her steps measured, guided by the steady cadence of the Duke beside her. She felt the coolness of the hall when they exited the ballroom, the thick shift in atmosphere as the world narrowed into a quieter space. The conservatory welcomed her with a different kind of silence, the hush of night air pressing against glass, the scent of damp leaves, the faint trickle of a distant fountain. She breathed in deeply, letting the coolness soothe the burning humiliation left by the ballroom. The Duke released her hand with deliberate gentleness, as though reluctant to break contact too abruptly. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I owe you an apology." She startled. "For what, Your Grace?" "For this evening's cruelty," he replied. "For the laughter you endured. For the unspoken rules that permit it." "You did not cause any of that," she said softly. "Perhaps not," he murmured, "but I am responsible for what I allow in my presence." His voice carried an old weariness beneath its controlled calm, a kind of exhaustion that did not belong to outward burdens, but to inward expectations. Something in that tone tugged at her, urging her to ask what she had never dared to ask of any man of rank. "Why did you accept the dance?" she whispered. "Why not step aside like the others? You must know how people talk." A long silence folded between them, deep enough that she could hear the soft brush of his glove as he ran a hand along the top of a marble railing. When he finally spoke, his words were softer than before, but far more intimate. "Because I listen differently than most men," he said, "and you speak differently than most women." Eleanor's lips parted in surprise. "I spoke very little this evening." "You did not need to," he said. "Your silence said more about courage than their words ever will." Her breath wavered. She turned slightly toward the sound of his voice. "Courage? I have felt anything but courageous." "Then allow me to tell you something without ornament," he replied. "When your companion chose me, I felt, briefly, that the world had stopped mocking sincerity long enough to recognize it." Her heart trembled. She could not see his expression, yet she sensed the shift in him, the quiet lowering of walls, the rawness behind his steady cadence. "And what sincerity is that?" she asked. "That you are not afraid to stand in a room that would rather pretend you are invisible," he murmured, "and that you do not ask for pity, even when it is offered like counterfeit coin." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "You speak as though you know something of that yourself." Another silence, a heavier one. "I do," he said at last. "More than you realize." Her puppy, sensing the tension, patted between them, touching its nose briefly to her boot before turning toward the Duke with a soft, questioning whine, as though asking him to continue. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Your Grace, what is it that you understand?" His reply came not as an answer, but as a quiet confession that hovered in the air with fragile weight. "Because, Miss Whitcomb," he whispered, voice edged with a truth he had not meant to reveal yet, "you are not the only one in that ballroom who cannot fully see." She froze, and before she could speak, before she could understand what he meant, he exhaled a breath that trembled faintly, then took a step back into the shadows, leaving her with only the echo of his unspoken truth pressing against the night. Eleanor stood motionless in the conservatory long after the Duke stepped back into the shadowed threshold, her breath caught between wonder and confusion. The soft drip of water from the fountain echoed faintly, filling the silence he had left behind. Her puppy pressed close to her boot, offering steady warmth, but the space around her felt altered, as though the very air held a question she was not yet brave enough to answer. His words played again in her mind, quiet but charged with unsettling truth. "You are not the only one who cannot fully see." What could he possibly have meant? The Duke, whose movements betrayed certainty, whose voice carried a power shaped by lineage, could not have been referring to sight alone. Yet the tone in his voice had held no metaphor, only something raw, almost wounded. She lifted a hand as though reaching toward where he had stood, but the cold space met her palm with nothing but its emptiness. Her cousin reappeared before she could gather her thoughts. His steps hurried, his breath uneven. "Eleanor, this has gone far enough," he insisted, pulling her from the hazy quiet. "You must come back at once. The guests are whispering that you have trapped His Grace into something inappropriate. Do you understand how dangerous rumors can become? Dangerous, as though she were the threat rather than the target." "I have done nothing improper," she said, trying to steady her tone even as doubt curled around her ribs. "I accepted an offer of fresh air." "From a duke," he snapped, "which alone invites speculation. And after that ridiculous display with the dog." The puppy growled, a soft, protective sound. Eleanor exhaled, drawing her hand back. "Please," she whispered, "I need a moment." But her cousin would not allow it. He was already guiding her back toward the ballroom doors, muttering under his breath about salvaging what reputation could be saved. Her steps faltered, not because of the murmurs she sensed waiting beyond that threshold, but because the Duke's absence had become its own weight, pulling at her like a question unanswered. She wanted, desperately, to speak with him again, to understand the truth he had nearly revealed, but she did not even know if he had remained in the room or slipped away entirely. When she entered the ballroom once more, the world sharpened. Conversations dropped to hushed murmurs. Even without vision, she felt the eyes upon her, their scrutiny heavy as winter frost. The orchestra had changed its tempo to something brisker, meant to lighten the atmosphere, but the mood of the crowd remained thick with speculation. The puppy pressed close to her heel, his small body tense. "Look at her," someone murmured nearby. "She thinks herself special now. She imagines the Duke's interest is genuine." How quaint. Each whisper struck with familiar sting, but Eleanor lifted her chin again, remembering the Duke's earlier words. "Your silence said more about courage than their words ever will." She repeated them in her mind like a prayer, steadying herself with their unexpected warmth. Her cousin tugged forward again, attempting to guide her toward the side of the room where the lesser suitors and wallflowers stood. But the puppy suddenly halted, pulling sharply against the small ribbon looped around her wrist. Eleanor stopped, startled, sensing his insistence. The dog let out a soft bark, not loud, but purposeful. Then she heard it, a footstep, one that moved toward her with deliberate calm and unmistakable confidence. "Miss Whitcomb," the Duke said, his voice no longer sheathed in the softness he had used outside, but resonant with intent. Her cousin froze beside her. The room stilled again, as though waiting to see whether His Grace would retreat or escalate the spectacle. Instead, he stepped to her side, not behind her, not before her, but beside her as an equal. Her cousin tried to speak. "Your Grace, with respect, this attention is unwelcome," the Duke finished, his tone polite yet edged with unmistakable finality. "I should think the opinions of strangers hold very little authority in a matter that concerns Miss Whitcomb's comfort." Eleanor felt her breath catch. His hand brushed lightly near hers, offering, not demanding, contact. The gesture was small, yet so boldly protective that she felt tears threaten. She did not take his hand yet, but she leaned subtly toward his voice, allowing him to feel her trust without overt display. A murmur swept the room. Someone scoffed. Another whispered that the Duke had lost his judgment entirely. A third voice muttered that perhaps some defect in him had remained hidden until now. Eleanor flinched at that last remark, though she tried to hide it. The Duke heard it. She felt the quiet fury radiate from him. Not loud, not explosive, but controlled with an iron restraint more powerful than any outburst. "Miss Whitcomb," he said gently, so only she and the closest listeners could hear. "May I ask you something?" She swallowed. "Yes." "Do you feel ashamed?" Her throat tightened. The question shocked her. "No," she whispered slowly, "but I feel humiliated." "That," he replied softly, is something I can remedy." Before she could process his meaning, he raised his voice just enough to reach the murmuring crowd. Not loud, not theatrical, but with a clarity that left no space for misinterpretation. "Miss Whitcomb is a woman of remarkable dignity," he said, "and I consider myself fortunate that her companion—" He glanced down at the puppy, who wagged once, as though in approval, "found me suitable company. If any here believe she has manipulated circumstance, then I assure you it is my own choice to stand beside her." A stunned silence followed. Eleanor's heart thundered wildly. Hearing him defend her so openly was almost too much, too bright, too tender, too impossible. But even as relief washed through her, she sensed a deeper truth beneath his words, something unsaid, something heavy. She remembered what he had whispered. "You are not the only one who cannot fully see." She wanted to ask him then, in that breathless pause, what secret he held behind those words. But the Duke spoke again, with quieter strength this time. "Eleanor," he murmured, using her name without title, his voice threading softly through her fraying composure. "There is something I must tell you, but not here." Her pulse skipped. Her cousin stiffened. The puppy whined softly, and the Duke added, with a steadiness that struck her like a hand closing gently but firmly over her heart, "Tonight, before the moon sets, you shall know the truth I have hidden from every soul in this room." The music resumed, but Eleanor heard only her heartbeat. The moon had climbed higher by the time Eleanor stepped onto the terrace where the Duke had asked her to meet him, its pale glow softened by drifting clouds that dimmed the night into something quiet and uncertain. The cold air touched her cheeks like a hesitant apology, and she felt the world narrow to the hushed sound of the fountain behind her and the faint rustle of leaves trembling in the winter breeze. Her puppy stayed at her heel, unusually still, as though sensing that what awaited her carried the weight of something irreversible. She tightened her grip on her cane, breath trembling despite her effort to steady herself. Each step she had taken from the ballroom to this secluded place felt like walking deeper into a truth she could no longer afford to ignore. The Duke was not immediately visible, but she sensed him before she heard him. His presence reached her like warmth pressing faintly through the cold. Unhurried, controlled, almost painfully sincere. His footsteps approached with deliberate gentleness, stopping just shy of where her hand might have brushed his coat had she reached out. She did not. She waited. "Miss Whitcomb," he said softly, and the muted reverence in his voice struck through her like light-piercing cloud. "Thank you for coming." She released a breath she had not realized she'd been holding. "You asked that I hear the truth before the moon sets," she murmured. "I am here for that reason alone." His silence expanded, filled with the strain of a man who had carried a secret long enough to carve itself into his bones. When he spoke again, his voice carried a fragile steadiness that made her heart tighten. "You asked why I said I, too, cannot fully see." Her fingers curled slightly around the polished ivory handle of her cane. "Yes." He inhaled, a slow breath that seemed dragged from somewhere deep inside him. "I meant it literally." The words struck her still. For a moment, she thought she had misheard, that his meaning must be metaphorical or philosophical. But his next breath dispelled that hope. "I'm losing my sight," he said quietly. "The physicians call it gradual. I call it inevitable." Her pulse stumbled. She felt the puppy shift in protective alarm. She steadied herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Since when?" He released a breath that trembled faintly. "Since last year." At first, it was only the edges of things that blurred. Then details, distance, faces, light. He paused, voice thickening with something he was trying desperately to contain. "I can see you now only because you are close. A step further, and I would lose the clarity of your features. A few more, and your outline would fade." Her heartbeat thrummed like a string pulled too tight. She forced herself not to step forward, not to reach for him, not to let emotion pull her into impulse. "Why did you hide this?" "You know why," he whispered. "A duke who cannot see is a duke who could be dismissed, manipulated, mocked." His voice dropped even lower. "Pity is a quieter cruelty than scorn. but it is cruelty all the same. She felt the truth of that settle over her like cold ash. They stood together in the night. Two people whose battles have been invisible to the world, yet expose them more than any wound that could be seen with eyes. I recognize something in you, he continued. Not because of your condition, but because of how you endured it. Not with bitterness, but with dignity sharper than the stares cast upon you. Emotion wrapped itself around her throat, tightening painfully. And so you protected me? No, he exhaled. Understood you. The words washed over her with a depth that unsettled her. She had spent years learning to quiet her loneliness, to fold her longing into the corners of her composure, to realize that he saw it, not through pity, but through recognition, shook something loose inside her. Do others know? She whispered. No one, he said. Not even my household. Not my advisors. Not my friends. But you told me. I did. Because you deserve truth, not performance. His breath caught faintly. And because you of all people would understand the terror of being judged for the one thing you cannot change. She stood trembling in a silence thick with meaning. The fountain trickled softly behind them. The moon lowered behind drifting clouds. Her puppy pressed closer, sensing the swell of emotion inside her. The Duke took one slow step nearer, and though he still did not touch her, the warmth from him eased some part of her she had not realized needed easing. I did not expect your companion to choose me, he murmured. But when he did, something inside me stilled, as though a truth I had been avoiding suddenly unfurled. His voice softened with a rare vulnerability. You were not meant to be mocked tonight. You were meant to be seen. Her breath trembled. And were you? He answered instantly, without a flicker of hesitation. From the moment you spoke your first word. A small cry escaped her, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, but something shorn from the edges of her heart. She lifted her hand until it hovered near his arm, uncertain whether she should bridge the space. He guided her gently with a shift of his stance, allowing her gloved fingers to meet the fabric of his sleeve, not pulling, not claiming, but offering a place to anchor her trembling. I feared, she whispered, that people laughed because they knew something I never would, that I was foolish to hope for anything at all. Hope, he said, is never foolish. Cruelty is. She closed her eyes, though sight meant nothing to her. The wind brushed her cheek. The faint hum of winter leaves filled the space between them. Something inside her, some long-silenced part, leaned into the warmth of his presence, into the quiet steadiness of his confession. And now, she whispered, what will they say? That a blind woman and a failing duke make a fitting pair. Let them, he murmured. What they say has no bearing on my choice. Choice, she echoed softly. You truly choose me? He stepped closer still, and this time his voice held nothing but certainty. Eleanor, I chose you before I realized what it meant to choose anything at all. You were courage in a room of performance. You were dignity when others offered disdain. You were truth in a sea of posturing. His breath shivered faintly. And I... The puppy barked suddenly, sharp and warning. The Duke froze. Eleanor felt something shift, not in the air but in him. His breathing changed, quickening almost imperceptibly, and she sensed tension ripple through his stance like a cold blade drawn in silence. What is it? She whispered. He inhaled sharply, and the fear she heard, fear he had buried beneath steel, cut through her. Eleanor, he said quietly, someone has learned of my condition. Her heart lurched. Who? I do not know, but someone has used it. The puppy growled again. Footsteps approached, and the Duke finished, his voice trembling with the weight of what he had tried to hide. And they are coming for us now.